basically, like having thought about it, remember how in micro we said the three main topics are labor markets, market structures, and market failure. All three of them came up. And then in macro, we've got the year 12, the four objectives, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and supply side policy. And then you've got trade and you've got development and the current account. Out of all of those things, the one thing that hasn't come up at all in detail is the current account, like deficits and surplus, um, the ways to reduce them. Obviously, trade came up with, I think, was it tariffs or free trade, but current account itself hasn't come up. Was there anything else that didn't come up at all? Like, did monetary policy and quantitative easing come up?
Yeah, kind of in the third essay for paper two.
Yeah. Wait, wasn't the third essay about reducing, like the best way to reduce the budget deficit?
Yeah, but like that was one of the points you could talk about, but it wasn't in like the actual question though.
Oh, okay. Okay, so monetary policy could also come up. That hasn't come up like in much detail either. And obviously, wherever possible, revise everything. But let's just do a bit extra on current account. So let's run through the basics of other topics really fast. And if you need to revise them in more detail, you can easily revise them by yourself. So for labor markets, the 15 mark question is only going to be about the factors of the supply and demand for labor. So the demand for labor, there are just three factors. The demand for the good itself, because demand for workers is a derived demand from the demand for workers. The productivity, and therefore the MRP of the worker, as well as how cheap or expensive equivalent capital is. So if machines can replace the worker, then we might reduce demand for the worker. The supply of labor, so you would choose to work more in a job if the wages are higher relative to the wages in other jobs, if the value for working is higher than the value for leisure, barriers to entry are low. If population is higher, then the market supply of labor would increase naturally. And also if occupational mobility is low. In terms of that, actually we'll come back to that. Labor can also be inelastic. So demand for labor can be inelastic if the good itself is inelastic. So let's say wages go up, the firm would still hire the worker if they can just raise the price of the good and people would still buy the good. So if let's say if the price of certain TVs went up, let's say if the wages for certain people, engineers in TV went up, um, then and they can't raise the price of TVs because people would just stop buying those TVs, then they wouldn't pay the workers more as well. But for whatever reason, if there was something else where they could just raise the price of the good, then that means the elasticity of labor is also low. So it's also inelastic. These are important not only for 15 markers, but also for multiple choice questions. Also, how easily can I swap the worker with capital? And if it's a low cost as a proportion of total costs. Supply of labor is elastic if there are, well, supply of labor is inelastic if there are vocational elements. So if a nurse has to work overtime, they might do it even if the pay is low because they might feel compelled to do it for um, because they feel like they're doing something good. And also if the length of the training period is low, if they don't need to do any extra training, and just everything over time becomes more elastic. For the 25 marker, just literally go back to the gender pay gap question because everything was already mentioned there. You've got a higher minimum wage in a monopsony. Um, you've also got provision of information and you've got education and training. But now with paper three, you can make the link to macroeconomics as well. And you can always discuss how these impact the supply side or just the other objectives in the macroeconomy. with market failure, the 15 markers just know all the market failures inside out. So you've got the externality diagrams, all four of them. Mention keywords like information failure and the fact that externalities might be ignored. Remember behavioral economics. The main ones we liked to talk about were computational weakness and bounded self-control. But all of these things have already come up. Um, and don't forget like little random market failures like the free rider problem. When a good is non-excludable, it means that people have no incentive to pay for it because they can free ride it instead. And that leads to a missing market because the 15 market could really be about anything. With the 25 marker, just know your basic government interventions and just know how they cause government failure in particular because of your evaluation. Market structures, just know all your diagrams and efficiencies. You can just read this on your own. Just make sure you remember what the meanings of all of these things are. And that basically covers all of microeconomics for your essay, like for your exam. There's nothing else you really need to know if you already remember all of these things from paper one. Go through the basics of macro one more time. There's like quick summaries where we've gone through the four objectives. So just remember key bits like why deflation is bad, people delay spending, why high inflation is bad, because wages don't go up in line with the inflation. Make sure you know the two types of unemployment, structural and cyclical. Really important because structural unemployment is going to require supply side policies, whereas cyclical unemployment is completely different. You have to use demand side policies. Also, one thing I learned myself, like realized myself, was that, you know, the paper two question about the budget deficit, somebody made a really cool point that if the budget deficit is cyclical, so cyclical doesn't just apply to unemployment, a budget deficit can also be cyclical, or a current account deficit can also be cyclical, which means its cause is purely because of the natural economic cycle. Okay. You have any questions, just ask me. So cool. Let's get to the main point. The main point was the current account deficit. I'll start with some boring bits, and then the 225 markers they're going to ask are either policies to reduce a current account deficit, policies to reduce a current account surplus, or if a country should even worry about a current account deficit. But before that, there's some bits for a 15 marker that people would often ignore. The current account is made up of four things: goods, services. So far pretty straightforward. So exports and imports of things like manufactured goods or primary commodities like fruit or lemons or whatever that are taken out of the country after they're bought. Services, which also count as imports or exports, but they are things that don't leave the country. So you might use a tourist or you might use like an agent to help you when you're there on holiday, like for tourism. Or you might go to a country for university and then leave after using the service. And then primary income and secondary income. So primary incomes are just money that goes into another country because of things you've worked for. For example, investments, or if you've worked in another country and then taken wages away. And secondary income is money that's gone to another country for no reason. So just as a gift, like for example, aid. The capital account is capital transfers. This is just transferring of fixed assets. Basically, it's when you get money from a patent or a copyright or a franchise. I think it's less important, but you just need to know that the balance of payments has more than one account. So the current account is the one we care about the most, but we also consider the capital account and the financial account, which is a more I think it's a replacement of this one. The financial account is just when money comes in or money goes out rather than goods going like so um I think the financial account is just a reverse of the current account. So if I import goods or services, money is leaving on the current account. So to reduce the current account deficit, let's just start with supply side policies. So supply side policies are policies that increase LRAS. I would give an example of my choice, or if the extract mentions, try to use the one that they've given. There are market-based supply side policies, and there are interventionist supply side policies. Market-based supply side policies include reducing income taxes, reducing corporation taxes. And interventionist supply side policies include spending more money on education and training, spending more money on infrastructure, and so on. Try to pick one where you've got nice examples. So if you can mention spending money on infrastructure or stuff like that. So you could mention HS2. HS2 was used to create a train line that goes from London to Manchester at a very fast speed. This is a good thing because it increases mobility of labor. It increases geographical mobility of labor. Where if you pick other policies like education and training, you're increasing occupational mobility of labor. These are really, really good points that link to both macro and micro. So supply side policies can increase either of the two types of mobility of labor, geographical or occupational. Uh, with any supply side policy, they would increase exports because, first and foremost, supply side policies improve quality, quantity, and cost of production. If those three things increase, that's what causes LRS to shift to the right in the first place, and therefore exports become more competitive. After drawing the diagram, as always, in macro, what do we always link our diagrams to? The four objectives. You could mention that if LRS shifts to the right, then price level would be lower, and that would make our exports even more competitive. So yeah, just try to link supply side policies to an example, because if you do that, you can go into more detail. So for example, education and training will not only increase quality, quantity, and cost of the goods produced at the end and make exports more competitive, they also increase it also increases structural, so occupational mobility of labor and reduces the problems or risk of structural unemployment and therefore reduces waste in the economy and increases the capacity. And for example, HS2 would increase geographical mobility of labor because it allows people to work further away from where they live. Another example is increasing work from home, so more deregulation and encouragement of work from home. Because if there wasn't a such thing as online, then maybe we couldn't have had this call, and this call is increasing the capacity of the economy. So then the two evaluations are just opportunity cost and time lag. Time lag is more important to talk about in more detail because if there's a current account deficit, we don't want to wait 3 or 4 or 5 years before we become more competitive. However, supply side policies are probably the best policy to be better in the long run and reduce like long-term risk of a current account deficit. Ismail's favorite one is contractionary demand side policies. So Ismail, could you please explain that in a very high level?
No, my favorite one's actually tariffs, but this is my second favorite one.
Okay, well, Okay, do this one.
Okay. Okay, so basically, yeah. So let's say we increase interest rates, then the reward for the cost of borrowing increases, so we're more likely to save. And because we have less money, we decrease consumption. And if we decrease consumption, that means we're going to decrease consumption on imports, which will mean AD will shift left and the budget will get better because we'll spend less on imports.
Not the budget, the balance of payments, but
The
otherwise.
the, the current,
Well,
yeah.
Very good.
wait,
There are two.
I swear if imports are less, then AD doesn't increase.
It
Oh wait,
shifts
yeah,
left.
yeah.
I
Okay.
think he mentioned. I think he meant. I don't know what he said, but I think he meant that AD would go down.
I
Okay.
said it shifts left.
AD shifts left, but that causes people maybe to uh lose their jobs, for example, and
Yeah.
there's more unemployment, so people have less disposable income and people spend less on imports. Also, if AD shifts to the left, the price level goes down, and if the price level goes down, our exports become more competitive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As always in macro, link it to the four objectives. It's very simple but very important. And just use your diagram to assist you because it makes things so much easier. This is called expenditure reducing policies. If you see this word, don't get scared. It just means it's a policy that causes reduction of spending rather than switching of spending. Ismail, if you pick this example, the benefit of this is that because it's low-key a dead policy, there's two amazing evaluations you could use. Could you please explain them?
So okay, I know one, yeah, that's obviously that lower standard of living and all of that is obviously negative.
Yeah,
Um, and it is the second one, it like conflicts objectives because like unemployment will increase and like standards of living drop and then economic growth also falls.
perfect. And the way to explain that would be, what would be the reason a country would ever care about reducing its balance of payments current account deficit? Well, the reason would be because it's one of the four objectives. So why would a country then improve that one objective when it causes the other three objectives to get worse? It causes worse economic growth, it causes more unemployment, and it causes a worse price level. Okay. And in order to fix the other three, you have to do expansionary demand side policies anyway. So it makes no sense to do contractionary demand side policies. Well, you could argue that way as well. There's also one more really, really fun one to write about. So you mentioned, Ismail, you mentioned raising interest rates. What do higher interest rates do to exchange rates?
It makes them like increase.
Yep. So higher interest rates means there's higher reward for saving, and this increases this increases demand for the pound. If demand for the pound increases, the value of the pound increases. If the value of the pound increases, exports become less competitive. Wow, what a bad policy to use, and what a great evaluation. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yeah.
Calm.
Yep.
Okay, good. But yeah, we've only done two of them, and there are four options. The only thing you have to look out for is if the question mentions specifically to talk or to compare about these. Apart from that, you could do whatever you want. Um, I wouldn't really do this. Well, actually, if we're doing devaluation of the currency, that's a really good one. You could mention it as lowering interest rates to devalue the currency because of lower demand for the currency and therefore make exports more competitive. You can link it to how there's positive demand side impacts as well, and AD would go up. But the AD could also cause you to have more disposable income and maybe import more stuff. We don't know. Also, it would raise price level and make your country less competitive. And also, it could be, well, therefore, it confuses itself with monetary policy. So countries generally don't use interest rates to devalue their currency. You could mention another country which has a fixed exchange rate could easily do this. And for them, it would definitely be the best policy because there are way less conflicts if they have currency reserves, which allow them to easily manipulate the value of their currency. Lastly, we have tariffs. The only extra thing I would mention compared to normal is that it's an expenditure switching policy. So tariffs, I would literally just say a tariff is a protectionist measure that prevents free trade. A tariff is a tax on imports. Draw the diagram and explain how they make imports more expensive and reduce them from Q1, Q4 to Q2, Q3. That's a perfect paragraph. You mentioned retaliation and you mentioned your exports also get lower because other countries retaliate and put a tariff back on you. You could mention you can evaluate your evaluation by saying that it increases employment in the UK. And if that's the case, we could maybe benefit from economies of scale and lower cost over time, as we become really, really skilled and specialized in whatever we choose to do. And over time, we'll become the most competitive and then have a strong balance of payments every year. Okay. If this essay was to come up, that would be like a really, really good essay, but I'm honestly not sure. So try to revise everything. It's just one thing that hasn't come up at all, really. I'm going to mention tariffs again later when it comes to development, so pay attention to that as well. Should a country worry about a current account deficit? Let's make it, wait. I think I also forgot to mention with the devaluation of currency, you can mention the Marshall-Lerner condition. Basically, I've kept the notes as short as possible. So if you print them or annotate on them, then you can add the other details. With the current account deficit, the most important point is this, because it's the most easy and fundamental point to use. After that, you can show off with loads of cool points. So number one, if there's a current account deficit, X is low and M is high. If X minus M is low or negative, AD will be low. So first of all, it's one of the four objectives. And second of all, if AD shifts to the left, it will impact the other three macroeconomic objectives, as there would be lower economic growth, there'd be more unemployment, and there'd potentially be deflation. You could mention low exports means that there's low demand for workers because labor is a derived demand of demand for goods and services. So these additional points are the ones that boost the quality of your essay a lot. So try to be thoughtful about explaining certain bits in more detail where you can. No. So X minus M is a small percentage of AD. So if C, I, and G, or let's say G is low or medium, it doesn't really matter. Let's say C and I are very, very, very high, and X minus M is low. AD could still be very high. That's completely fine because it means that you're meeting the other three objectives. And also on top of that, imports are usually a luxury good, so they have a elastic, but their income elasticity of demand is high. So the more a country's real GDP per capita and everybody's real incomes, the more the demand for imports, and therefore balance of payments may naturally get worse. You could also mention that it's a cyclical current account deficit because it's just because of economic growth that's causing the deficit. If it is temporary as well, exchange rates will adjust and current account deficit will fix itself. So we talked about that with a different example earlier. And I might also talk about it when we're talking about development. There's something called Dutch disease for developing countries. If they rely on primary commodities, let's say apples, if the demand for their apples gets really high because they're able to grow really good quality apples in a particular season, the value of their currency would rise because of all of the demand. If the value of that currency rises, then the demand for those apples would fall because all of a sudden they become less competitive. So it's not reliable for the developing country to focus on primary commodities. And likewise, we don't need to worry too much about current account imbalances if this is our view. The last point is overdependence. You can link it to why a tariff is a really important policy as well. So if there's a current account deficit, it's a sign, if this is happening every year, it's a sign that your supply side is weak and their supply side is strong. If you're reliant on their goods or services and something happens to either currency, then there might be an economic shock in their country and therefore in your country, and it could cause a massive recession or difficulty, such as extra cost of living because of like oil prices increasing. Economic development. With this, I would revise it as the main barriers to economic development and the main ways to improve economic development. First of all, it's really, really important to understand the difference between economic growth and economic development. Economic growth is a part of economic development, but not all of it. Economic development includes, well, if it's measured by HDI, the Human Development Index, it includes economic growth, so real GDP per capita being higher than usual, health being higher and better than before, so life expectancy at birth, as well as literacy rates and education being good as well, everybody being able to say read and write. One reason for poor economic development is poor savings. The Harodoma cycle explains that poor savings means that less people put money in banks. If less people put money in banks, then banks have less money to invest and therefore invest less. Therefore, firms have weak capital stocks. And if firms have weak capital stocks, then economic growth would be low and incomes would also be low. So there'd be no chance of economic growth. There'd also be no chance of tax revenue. If you write about this, you can also evaluate it by saying the reason is not poor savings, but maybe it could be poor infrastructure and poor banking. Maybe they don't have access to banking to even save in the first place, or they don't know about saving. So it could be an education related issue or provision of information related issue. And then link economic growth to economic development. Do not just stop at economic development. Explain why the incomes or the tax revenue is needed to spend on people's education and health, because without the three things together, you would not have economic development. So part of the reason is also poor infrastructure, bad schools, or not enough schools and not enough hospitals, and not enough education and information provision about these things. So the development trap just explains that poor health means that people cannot work. People may go sick or may not be fit enough to go to work every day or do difficult jobs such as farming or manufacturing. If people cannot work and earn incomes, then they can't spend on their children's health and education, or they can't contribute to the government's tax system, and therefore the government can't invest in health and education. Corruption and poor knowledge is a small point, but you could just link it to the other ones. But most importantly, a lot of developing countries have overdependence on their primary sector. Primary goes to manufacturing, basically secondary, and then tertiary is services. So the primary sector is things like apples or oil or gold. But these things, say apples, have very volatile prices. I already talked about Dutch disease, where even if there was demand for a country's apples or mangoes, demand would go up and the price of the currency would go up, and then they'd become less competitive again compared to another country. Also, if the country was to grow, these basic goods are very income inelastic. So the demand for these would not continuously grow. They're always going to stay low forever and ever because there's only so much apples that people need. All of these things should be linked to the policies. So let's just start with this one. You've all revised tariffs so many times and a tariff can be used again in development. But I just realized the way to explain a tariff would be to explain that most developing countries only have a comparative advantage in commodities, things from the primary sector. We explain why this is a bad thing for that developing country, and it's something that's holding them back from development. Because the prices are very volatile and the demand is income inelastic. So, what should the country produce? The country should produce stuff related to manufacturing. They can't. Why can't they do this? It's because if somebody wants to buy a chair which was manufactured, they might buy it from a neighboring country which is already good at producing chairs and therefore produces them cheaper. So there's no incentive for anybody in that developing country to try to make chairs. If the government were to put a tariff on other countries around them, it would make the price of the other countries' chairs more expensive. Everybody in that developing country needs chairs. It's far more beneficial, even though it costs more, for them to make chairs by themselves. So put a big tariff on importing chairs, which would force somebody to open up a business where they make chairs. You do a tariff diagram and you explain that this creates, firstly, it reduces imports of chairs, and it also creates jobs in the economy, okay? If it creates jobs, then that leads to all the other things related to development. So more incomes, more spending on health and education, potential to collect tax revenue, and potential for further investment in health and education. Also, the tariff would lead to tax revenue as well. So it's a really, really good policy. And it works quite well because everybody is going to want a chair at some point or other manufactured goods. So having a closed economy with limited FDI might also be a good thing. Tariffs and spending on health and education are called interventionist policies. It's where the government enter into markets to change them. Whereas market-based policies are supply-side policies where the governments leave and deregulate markets to make them more free and therefore more competitive. These two are also very important, and we would just link it to the development trap. The development trap was where people have bad health and bad education, and therefore they cannot work. And if they cannot work, they have low income. And if they have low incomes, they don't have money or they don't contribute to the tax system, which would lead to further improvements in health and education. You could count it as an interventionist supply-side policy and do an LRS to the right diagram. And you can explain your normal evaluations, such as opportunity cost and time lag. If you want to go into further detail about development, you could mention that the developing country is going to struggle even more than another normal country to generate funds to pay for the health and education. So we talk about budget deficits as a proportion of GDP, as a percent of GDP. Their GDP is already going to be low. So their national debt could become a very high percent of GDP. And that's a very scary and dangerous thing because they would not be able to afford interest payments every year. So it's very risky or just impossible for the country to spend such money on education and training or healthcare by itself without the help of other policies such as FDI, which is the next one, or without the help of tariffs, which generate tax revenue. You can evaluate your evaluation by mentioning that the country can make a plan and maybe ask for aid from another country or from a charity. And some charities or organizations are a bit annoying because they might give aid and force the country to do free market-based policies, even though we just explained the benefit of the interventionist policies. Market-based policies are reducing income tax, reduce corporation tax, privatization, or removing minimum wages. All four of these have one thing in common. They reduce costs of production. Okay. If costs of production are lower, quality, quantity, and cost increases in the economy, especially quantity and cost, and that attracts FDI. FDI is when an MNC, a multinational corporation, brings technology and capital into a developing country and builds a long-lasting relationship in that country. Okay, so the MNC brings their own technology and knowledge and other stuff and invests into this in that country, whilst also benefiting from the low cost of production. Whilst with interventionist policies, we were overcoming the barrier, which was the development trap. With this, we're focusing on the Harodoma model, which said the best way to get out of poor development is by either increasing savings or by increasing capital stock. So when an MNC brings in technology and knowledge, you're improving capital stock, and that increases the creation of jobs, economic growth, incomes, therefore savings, therefore investment, therefore more capital stock. And now we're in a nice positive cycle. As always, link the higher incomes to spending on health and education or increased tax revenue, which can allow more spending on health and education. Evaluation of this is that the MNC can exploit workers by paying them really low wages and by not necessarily sharing the knowledge as much as they should. Okay. They'll also take out profits. So if Adidas enters into a country and makes profit, they're going to take the profit away rather than necessarily reinvest into that country and stuff nearby. However, sometimes the MNC might spend more money on the roads nearby or give workers like better stuff, skills, training, maybe shoes and like stuff like that. And that can benefit the economy. But if they don't, then the multiplier effect from the FDI will be very low. If they treat the workers badly, it might worsen their health. And the low pay and low savings and low tax revenue just defeats the purpose of the FDI. Therefore, you might argue that it's worth the government setting high corporation tax. So if there was to be FDI, the government could collect some tax revenue off it. And the governments might not have perfect information of how to use it. So therefore, your conclusion can be completely flexible and it depends on the extracts that are given and the question exactly. But usually a combination of these things would be good. Say a tariff to bring in tax revenue and to allow infant industries, manufacturing sector. So a tariff would allow infant industries in the manufacturing sector to grow and benefit from economies of scale, lower their costs and become more competitive. That tax revenue should be used on other interventionist policies, such as spending money on health and education. FDI can also help because it could bring in skills and technology and improve capital stock.